War II veteran who will tell his story for the benefit of the Library of Congress Veterans Committee. It's by an RCA Pro Edit camera, and the interviewer is Jack W. Boone. Harper, give us your full name.
It's Harper Dolvin.
What was your branch of service?
I was in the 8th Air Force.
What were the dates of your service, in and out?
In late 43 and out late 45.
You remember the exact dates?
No, do not.
Okay. What was your serial number?
3468 9775.
What was the highest rank you attained while you were in the service?
I was a tech sergeant, which is 3 stripes up and 2 down.
The name of your outfit?
The main outfit I was with was the 445th Bomb Group.
Where did you serve?
This was in England, in a little town called Tiverton.
Okay. Suppose we go back now and start with when you first went into service. Where were you living when you went into service?
Atlanta, Georgia. I was drafted and went into the service at Fort McPherson, Georgia, and was sent from there to Keesler Field, Mississippi for basic training. While I was in Keesler Field, just a little added something. We arrived at Keesler Field. It was cold and rainy, and we stood out in the rain for all day long, and finally we were given something to eat in mess tents, which we had to eat out of our mess kits. And long about 4:30 in the afternoon, they assigned a place that they'd been working on all day, which was down in the swamp, to set up tents. We set up tents that day, freezing to death, and finally got the tent set up, and we spent the night there. I made a tent up by the only paved road in sight, and the next morning my tent with 4 other people inside up were the only tent left standing. The rest of them had been washed away during the night. And because of this, about half of them went into the hospital after a day or 2, and we started off with 1,500 men and ended up with about 200.
What happened to the rest?
They were in the hospital, and they all, I think, lived, but they had to continue their basic training at a later date because of colds, pneumonia, and even had some spinal meningitis among the group.
How long were you there for basic training?
About 3 months.
Where did you go from there?
Went to Las Vegas, Nevada, which was an aerial gunnery school. At the aerial gunnery school, we had classrooms every day for 8 hours. At the end of the gunnery school time, we had about 2 weeks of actual flying time, which was shooting at targets. This was done outside of Las Vegas at Indian Springs, and Indian Springs is still an Air Force base today.
Did you pick the Air Force, or was that just assigned to you?
I picked the Air Force.
Do you recall the first few days that you were in the service? How old were you?
18.
Were you apprehensive about this change in lifestyle?
Not really. Young, foolish, didn't bother me at all, really. It was quite a change when you issued your uniforms and you have a series of shots and you're given a whole lot of information that what's going to take place. But it was interesting, and I thoroughly enjoyed my time in the service, and starting with basic training.
Do you remember your instructors?
Not by name, no.
Okay. How did you get through it? Was it a difficult time for you, or was it an easy time?
I think it was an easy time for me. It required a lot of physical ability, which I had, and it did not bother me at all in this respect.
Was your term all during World War II, or did you serve in the Korean War?
No, all in World War II.
Okay. What exactly do you recall about your first trip overseas?
Could I go back before that?
Yes.
Let me go back to another beginning. Went to Amarillo, Texas as an aircraft mechanic school and spent time and graduated from aircraft mechanic school and became a sergeant. And so the time that I was in Las Vegas, I was basically a sergeant. And we learned a lot in gunnery school. We learned not only how to assemble and disassemble guns, even in the dark, but we learned the basic of what we were supposed to do. Aircraft identification, how to operate the turrets on the different aircraft, how to fire a machine gun so that you could hit something with it. It required a great deal of thought, and that was right up my alley. I thoroughly enjoyed it. How to pack parachutes. The instructors always said, you remember, you might be jumping with this parachute, so you better pack it right. So I thoroughly enjoyed that part of it, and it was very educational, and I wouldn't have taken anything for the time spent doing it.
And then after that, did you go overseas?
Nope. Then I went to gunnery instructor school at Fort Myers, Florida, where I became a gunnery instructor by trade. Went from there to out on the Mexican border at Laredo, Texas, and spent some additional time in another gunnery school so that I was proficient in the flying part of it. Then I was sent to Las Vegas, Nevada as an instructor, where I had served originally as a student, and I instructed the final 2 weeks in gunnery school in Las Vegas, and that was great. We flew 8 hours a day. I was usually given the job of instructing officers.
What type of aircraft were you flying in?
Flying B-17s at that time.
Mm-hmm. Tell us about a couple of your most memorable experiences during that period.
In Las Vegas, flying every day, 8 hours a day, 7 days a week, could really get to be something special. Every week we had a new group of students, and we found out the very first day that they thought they knew enough to get them through, and after the first time of shooting at a moving target, they realized that they could not survive without knowing more. We had at that time, we had a skeet range, we had a mobile trap range where you shot at target, and then you shot at targets that were pulled by AT-6s, aircraft, and you shot at a target from the airplane. The old B-17s at that time had open windows on the side gun, so it got awfully cold up there. So you, even in Las Vegas, Nevada, which was hot down on the ground, but terribly cold when you got up above 10,000 feet. The only real experience I had there that would be of any interest was we had a aircraft that the engine went out on it out over the desert, and it became doubtful as to whether we would get back to the base or not. So we started lighting the aircraft by throwing things out that were unnecessary, ammunition. Even some machine guns were thrown out to lighten the aircraft so it would make it back. And we made it back just by the skin of the teeth. There were several people had to bail out in this situation, but I was not one of them. It was exciting.
You didn't have to bail out?
No, did not.
Okay. All right. Is there anything else you can tell us about that period?
Not really. Being an instructor and doing the same thing every day might to some people get to be monotonous, but it wasn't for me. I think I put in some 2,000 hours during that time. And you got extra pay for flying, and by then I was a staff sergeant, so making pretty good pay. And I got married along about that time on a leave and took my wife back to Las Vegas, where we lived in town for a short time, and I commuted to the base every day at 5 o'clock in the morning to spend 8 hours flying.
What did you do after that?
I went to North Carolina, Greensboro, Chapel Hill area, to Air Force Base up there. Was getting ready to go overseas. This was the kind of the distribution point. Then they sent me to New York, Brooklyn, New York, and from Brooklyn we caught the Queen Mary to go overseas on. The Queen Mary at that time was, of course, the largest ship afloat in the Normandy. The particular trip that we went over on the Queen Mary, Winston Churchill and his party had been to the U.S. and they were returning to England on the same ship. So we had more escorts than usual crossing the sea. We also had a group of nurses from South America that occupied one floor, so the quarters and all were not as filled with people as they might have been on a normal voyage. We only had 8 people in the cabin made for 2. So while being crowded, it wasn't as crowded as it would have been if hadn't been Churchill party on board. In the Queen Mary, since Churchill was aboard and they were anxious to get back, instead of using the zig-zag pattern that was normally used, they ran almost completely straight. But they had escorts that would pick them up, and the ship going, Queen Mary going faster than the escort ships could keep up with, they would soon be out of sight and behind the Queen Mary, and we'd pick up 2 more escorts. And also aircraft were flying as cover also. So it was a fairly safe trip. It took 5 days, which was a record voyage, and that was awfully fast for those days. I sat up in the netting at the front of the ship and enjoyed every minute that I had free time on the ship. It was fascinating to me that you ate in such a deluxe dining room that the Queen Mary had at that time with all of the soldiers there. When we landed in Glasgow, Scotland, where we disembarked, Churchill's party was going to be the first to go off of the ship by tenders. And he came down on the elevator where I happened to be standing and made a short speech that the American soldiers coming to England had really been the force that had saved England, and that England would always feel grateful for the soldiers. He had a cigar in his mouth and gave the old victory sign, and off he went. But even being that close to such a personality remains fresh in my mind.
What was this port?
This was in Glasgow, Scotland.
Yeah. Okay. Now from there, where did you go?
I was assigned to the 445th Bomb Group at this time. Let me tell you a little story. We got off of the ship, and all of the soldiers had duffel bags and extra bag, most of them, and everyone was going to a different place, and I was given the assignment of seeing that all of the bags got on the same train that the soldiers were going on. So I got to stay in Glasgow a couple of extra days, and when I left, I was the only soldier left on the dock there with 2 little bags and not knowing what train to catch or anything else. But I caught a train and it went to London, as you had to do in those days, and you went to London and back up to Tiverton, which was my home base, which was nothing but a little crossroad stop. And the train went through, and if it had a flag out, the train would stop. If it didn't have a flag out, it would just keep on going. It ran between Norwich and London every day, 2 trains. Anyhow, I got off of the train, and it was out in the middle of nowhere. And I dragged my bag onto the gate, and when I arrived at the 445th Bomb Group, they had come off of operations that day. They had lost 8 planes. They were not flying. I reported to the commanding officer as a gunnery instructor, and he says, well, we'll have plenty for you to do in a few days when we get some new crews in, but right now we don't. And as he went over my resume, he said, aircraft mechanic. He says, we're going to give you a plane to repair. He says, we don't need a gunnery instructor today, but we'll need you in a couple of weeks. But in the meantime, we have these planes that are disabled, and we need to get them back to flying. And you pick out a plane that you would like and go to work on it. So I picked out a plane. I forget what the name of it was. We changed the name of the plane from whatever it was to Patches, because it had in the plane, in the tail section, under the wings and everywhere else, it had hundreds and hundreds of holes that were put in there by flak. This flak had just penetrated the outer rim of it, but if you tried to fly it, of course, it would rip further out. So we started cutting aluminum patches and finding different ways to hold them on the aircraft. This plane shows up later in my story in England, so it was the reason I wanted to mention it. And I have to give an experience. I was given a job of repairing it, and when I looked at the tail end of this plane, it didn't look repairable. So I got to calling other bases, and I found a plane that had a rear tail section that we could use, but I had to go get it. So I go to our commanding officer, which is a long story, but this commanding officer had a hard time making decisions. And I asked him for a truck to go get the tail section of this plane in. And he hemmed and hawed and never did really give me permission. So I go to the motor pool and tell the officer there the situation and get a truck and take off to the other base without any orders at all. And I get over there, and I don't have a bit of trouble getting the tail section and bringing it back and putting it on the plane. I found out later that I need another part, and they have it, so I go back through the same procedure. I still don't get permission to go. And as I start to enter the base, the MP stopped me and says, where are your orders? I don't have any orders. Well, you don't get in this base without any order. Well, here I am stuck between my base and the other base in a truck that I really shouldn't have out, and going to get something I really didn't have the authority to go to get.
Did you fly any?
I flew. Good story. I flew 13 official missions. Every new crew that come over, I would fly with the new crew on their first mission, if possible, to check out to see if they knew what they were doing. One experience. On a long flight over Germany, it was necessary to transfer fuel from one tank to another to keep the aircraft flying. Some of the engineers on it that were responsible for that job, and also responsible for being between the co-pilot and the pilot on takeoff and operated the top turret, had a big job. Some of them didn't even know how to transfer fuel. There were several occasions where the engines would actually go dead flying because he didn't know how to transfer fuel. So this was one of my big responsibilities, to make sure they knew what they were doing when they got in the air. And when they came back to ground, they always came back to gunnery school because they realized that they needed to know things that they didn't know after their first mission.
Did you, were you shot at?
Oh, yeah.
And did you have any casualties in your crew?
Oh, yes, we had a few casualties. I have to tell another story. When a person flying with a crew was sick or could not fly, that crew would be grounded. So a lot of times I would fly a mission under somebody else's name just to fill in so that they would be left with their crew and their crew could fly that day. It was not an official mission. I was flying unofficially. Shouldn't have done it. But I realized that I really wasn't flying, so if the plane got shot down, I wouldn't be lost because I wasn't there. But it was on one of these missions that I was flying in somebody else's name that a piece of flak got hung in my boot. It penetrated the boot and hit my leg, and I didn't even know I was hit till I got back to the ground, and we were going to debriefing and taking off our heavy clothes, and when I pulled off the boot, it was full of blood. Well, about 2 or 3 weeks later, Robert Reed got a Purple Heart because I was flying under his name that day. So,
and did they award you the Purple Heart?
No. The man, the name was on the flight roster was the one who got the Purple Heart. And he was in the hospital that day.
For goodness sakes.
Of course,
Okay.
mine was just a Band-Aid scratch. It wasn't anything serious.
Okay, where did you get out of the service?
Charleston, South Carolina.
When was that?
45.
And then what did you do?
Went in the used car business.
Used car business?
Yeah.
Okay, and did you stay in that for quite a long time?
52 years.
52 years?
Yeah, right.
Okay. Is there anything else you'd like to add to this tape that we haven't covered?
I have a lot of tales I would like to tell. I told one to the Kiwanis group, and I'll tell it again just for the record. Our group was scheduled the minute the war was over to, we were going to Japan, of course, by the way of the United States. So we were getting ready to go, and I was given the job of seeing that all the planes, everybody got out before I got on that was in the flying crew. So I went out and got on this last plane, and we had one extra plane that we didn't have pilots and co-pilot for, so we had gotten one from another base over there. And when I got on the plane, I looked at it and I said, this plane's not going to fly the way it's loaded here. It has too many people on it, and the baggage is in the wrong place. So I go up to the captain and I say, Captain, this plane is not loaded right, and it's not going to fly. And he says, Sergeant, do you have anything to do with the loading of this plane? I said, no, sir. And he said, well, I suggest that you go on back and have a seat. So I start back and I said, it ain't going to fly. He says to his co-pilot, says, get that smart-ass sergeant's name, rank, and serial number, and we'll put him on the report when we get to our first stop. So I go back and sit down, and the plane gets and revs up its speed, and this is the B-24. B-24 has a nose wheel in the front, and when it goes down the runway, it gets up to the full takeoff speed, and the front wheel lifts up off the ground, but the back end of the aircraft just goes right down on the runway. And you've never seen such a fireworks display in all of your life. The sparks that are just flying everywhere from it, and it almost tears off the back end of the plane, but finally it gets up in the air. But when it gets in the air, it's not flying, it's just kind of hovering there, hanging there. And the co-pilot comes back and says, the captain wants to see you. So I go running up to the front to see what it is, and he says, Sergeant, can you make this thing fly? Can you level it out? And I said, sure. I reach over and I push all the throttles up to full speed. He says, you're going to burn up an engine. I said, yes, and you're going to fall out of the sky. So I go back and move the people up to the front, some in the nose, some in the radio compartment, some in the bomb bay, put all of the bags up to the middle of the plane, and about 5 or 6 minutes later, the plane is flying normal. So the plane made its first landing in Shannon, Ireland. This was kind of a shakedown of only about a 3-hour flight. So when we landed at Shannon, I knew that that aircraft was going to be grounded. So my first thought was to catch another plane because that one was surely going to be grounded. So when we landed, I was the first off of the aircraft with my bags, and I hustled and found another plane that was getting ready to take off and asked the pilot if I could fly, and I knew all of the regular pilots, so he said sure, and I got on board. I never did know whether the captain had put me on report or not. I hope not. But anyhow, as soon as I got on the plane, I said, there's something familiar about this plane. It should have been familiar because it was old patches that I had repaired the first day that I got into the 445th Bomb Group. And when it got to Shannon, when it got to the next stop, which was in Iceland, some of the patches had popped off of that thing. So sure enough, they grounded old patches in Iceland. So I spent an extra 4 or 5 days in Iceland before we could get out with another plane. And as far as I know, patches were still sitting in Iceland when we left. But I did get to spend the extra 4 days in Iceland because of the incident anyhow.
Okay, can you tell us something now about your life after the service and up until bring us up to date?
Okay. Kind of mundane in a way, and yet it was exciting to me. I was in the used car business in Atlanta, Georgia for the 52 years. During that time, I really had only 2 locations. One of them was right uptown Atlanta behind the Medical Arts Building. And when the new road was cut through there, I had to move, and I moved on Bankhead Highway between Ashby Street and Northside Drive. And I bought the property there and stayed there for 17 to 18 years until I decided to close. Stayed a couple of extra years that they didn't want to stay to sell the property, but very successful in it. Didn't get rich, but made a good life, had a good time, did a lot of traveling. I think my passport during that time, I had 46 or 47 countries on it. My wife died in 2001, remarried a lovely lady, Eleanor Evans, and we have enjoyed traveling and probably have another 18 or 20 countries on our new passports at this time, and plan to put a whole lot more on it. I'm involved in church activities in the Kiwanis, Marietta Golden K Kiwanis, which is a great group, and play a little golf, have declining eyesight to a certain extent through macular degeneration, but that's no excuse for not doing all of the things that I love to do.
Do you belong to any veterans organization?
I do not.
Do you keep up with any of the people that you were in the service with?
Not in a long time. I did for a while, but it seems like old friendships, when everyone goes their different ways, you finally lose contact.
Well, thank you, Harper Dolvin, for telling us the story, and thank you for being for your service to